Hello and welcome to the sixth talk of our online series, Behind the Scenes Analysing Anglo-Saxon Rendlesham. I'm Alice DeLeo, the Project Delivery Officer at Suffolk County Council Archaeological Service, and today we'll be hearing from Charlotte Scull about the zoo archaeological evidence from Rendlesham. We're excited to be hosting this online series in partnership with two projects. Rendlesham Revealed, led by Suffolk County Council Archaeological Service, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and the Lordship and Landscape Project, led by Christopher Scull, funded by the Leverhulme Trust. You can find the video of our earlier talks on our website at heritage.suffolk.gov.uk/Rendlesham. I will now introduce you to Charlotte Scull. Charlotte is a zoo archaeologist specialising in the Anglo-Saxon period, and was a sessional lecturer teaching zoo archaeology at University of Reading, having completed her PhD there, focusing on animal bones and stable isotope analysis. Now Charlotte is a history teacher at Shotton Hall Secondary School. Charlotte was the animal bone specialist for the analysis of the fieldwork which took place in Rendlesham in 2014. So Charlotte, when you're ready, over to you.
Thank you, Alice. Good morning, everyone. So, as Alice said, in 2014, I assessed and analysed animal bone from Rendlesham. And today, I'm going to talk about some of the principles of zoo archaeological analysis, with a particular focus on what these methods can tell us about life at Rendlesham and the role and significance of this site. So firstly, I'm going to briefly take a step back and address why it is that animal remains are of so much value to us in reconstructing past lives, and in particular so useful to understanding the status and role of Anglo-Saxon central places in their wider landscape context. So animal bones usually make up one of the most abundant artefact classes at archaeological sites. But the full kind of interpretive potential of animal bones as material culture was recognised quite a bit later than other methods in archaeology. It's now widely accepted that the analysis of animal bones can inform on human agency, experience, belief, preferences, as well as on economic and environmental questions. So zoo archaeology isn't just concerned with animals in general, it's focused on the animals which end up on archaeological sites. So this is the animals which are for the most part exploited by people. And I use this painting here quite a lot when introducing zoo archaeology, because I think it illustrates particularly well the value projected onto different species and the distinctions that we make, which shape which animals we choose to exploit. For example, why in a typical Western diet we wouldn't eat cat, but we would happily eat something like pig. So essentially, livestock choices aren't always environmentally determined. They're shaped by cultural values, and from looking at the animal remains, we can kind of attempt to reconstruct these values and beliefs in past communities. So, pulling the focus back to Anglo-Saxon England, there are a lot of questions relating to Anglo-Saxon assemblages that are important, but I'm going to focus a little bit on the questions of the exploitation of wild and domestic animals, which is a particularly kind of interesting area here. So the landscape of Anglo-Saxon England would have been very different from today and had a number of wild species that we no longer have, including bears and wolves and higher quantities of deer and things like wild boar. In the post-Roman kind of early Anglo-Saxon period, the evidence suggests that these species, wild species, weren't heavily exploited and that the wilderness was generally avoided. But into the Middle Saxon period, the archaeological record changes, and there's evidence that elites, the kind of the new elites, were engaging in activities like hunting and falconry and were consuming more wild species as a conspicuous display. So the presence of wild species on sites in this period, especially with evidence of processing and butchery, can be strongly linked to these elite activities. So understanding the representation and use of domestic animals is also really important. These are the species that tend to make up the bulk of animal bone assemblages. And what's usually particularly telling is the comparative representation of the three main domesticates, which are sheep, cattle and pig. And among other things, these representations, this balance, can tell us the primary product consumed or produced at the settlement. And quite often these representations can change over time. For example, at a number of sites of this period at Yarnton, Quarrington, Lyminge, West Heatherton and at Flixborough, the proportion of sheep increases between the early and middle Saxon periods, corresponding with the growth of the textile industry. And that's just an example, but at other sites the balance shifts as well. So we've got a little idea of some of the things that are of interest and that we're looking for. So I'm going to move on to the assemblage at Rendlesham. So to give a quick introduction, there were almost 11,000 fragments of bone excavated at Rendlesham, around 80 kilograms from the test excavations, which when compared to other sites of the period and region isn't an enormous assemblage. But if we consider that it's only a relatively small proportion of the wider site that's been excavated, it is actually quite an extensive sample. Another important point to make is that the condition of this bone was not good. Generally, the preservation was quite poor, and the majority of the bones were really small fragments and quite eroded. This isn't surprising given the disturbance from agricultural activity at the site and the sandy soil, which is quite acidic. But it just means I don't have many lovely pictures of complete skeletons to show you. It's mostly just tiny fragments. In terms of chronological representation, which is what I've got on the graph here, while there were animal bones from the small amount from the late Iron Age through to the later Saxon contexts, this graph shows that the majority of fragments, almost 9,000, came from the Trench 6 dark midden layer. So the bulk of the animal bone information relates to the 7th, early 8th century, which is the believed peak activity at the site. And this is the period that I'll largely be referring to in the following slides when we're looking in greater detail at the assemblage. So the first factor to look at is the species which are represented. And for the most part, there tends to be a correlation between the diversity of the species represented at sites and the status and wealth at the site. So the higher the diversity, usually, the higher the status of the site. This isn't always the case, but it tends to be. So there was quite a diverse selection at Rendlesham for the area excavated, but it wasn't as diverse as some other sites of a similar type and period. There were no cetaceans, which is sea mammals, which we do see at other sites, and actually not very many wild fauna. If we look here, there wasn't actually that many. But this could relate to the nature of the areas which were excavated. Not on the graph because they were quite small quantities, but there was also fish in the assemblage, hawk, sparrowhawk, hare, and crane in the late Saxon material as well. But what's really clear here is that cattle dominate. Cattle were a very high status commodity in this period actually, and they dominate other important sites like Yevering. looking at Anglo-Saxon England as a whole, the dominance of cattle isn't unusual at sites, but when looking more closely at rural East Anglia, it's sheep and sheep husbandry which tend to be the most common, suggesting really that the high numbers of cattle at Rendlesham may have more to do with their cultural significance than the local environment. Even more interestingly, across all the phases and trenches, the relative abundances of the three main domesticates stays the same. And this could mean a number of things. But one thing could be, as the husbandry remains the same, it could be that Rendlesham's role and importance is staying consistent over time. Unlike other sites, like the sites I mentioned earlier, where the relative abundances of sheep, pig and cattle change over the centuries as site function and importance changes. So the next thing I'm going to go through is ageing and body part representation for the three main domesticates. So when we can determine the age at which an animal was slaughtered, we can begin to piece together kill patterns and so the goals of husbandry. I'm going to talk about this alongside body part representation, which is self-explanatory, which parts of the skeleton are actually being excavated. And this can tell us about the use of different areas of the site for either selected disposal or processing. And it can also tell us if a wider site might be being provisioned for, if there are high numbers of meat-bearing bones, or if animals are being raised and slaughtered locally, where we might see higher numbers of the sort of low utility elements like skulls and feet bones. So if we start with the cattle ages, the graph shows that a high proportion of calves, young baby cows, were culled at the site, which is quite unusual. Calf remains are quite scarce actually on Anglo-Saxon sites. The majority of cattle in most assemblages are adults. It's mature and elderly cattle that are the most frequent at Flixborough, at Brandon and at Wycombe Bonhunt. There's this kind of slight peak of very old specimens here, and this suggests a level of cattle raising here, that we've got the baby cows right through to the older specimens, and the body part representation as well. We've got all parts of the skeleton represented here, so this suggests that they are being raised on site or locally. If we go back to these calves here, it's only at West Stow, an early Anglo-Saxon site, that there is a sort of similar peak in juvenile cattle. And this is attributed to the self-sufficiency of this rural site and the culling of excess calves so as not to have to feed them. And the slaughter of surplus calves can be regarded as a measure of frugality, but it could also be interpreted as kind of conversely as a consequence of affluence. This is because to slaughter an animal in its early years, which could, if kept into adulthood, provide traction, breeding, milk, leather and horn working, suggests that these commodities maybe weren't needed by the presumably already prosperous community. So there could be a number of other reasons for the slaughter of calves, but ultimately the byproduct or intended product would have been suckling veal. So beef is the predominant high status food in Middle Saxon England, before seemingly being replaced by pork in the 10th century. And calf meat would have been a particular delicacy. So the presence of a food considered to be a delicacy like calf meat at Rendlesham would have certainly, I think, made an impression at a public feast, public meal. So if we move on to the pigs, all of the age groups of pig were represented, we can see there. And as with the cattle, this suggests that they were probably raised on site or locally. There's a really high number of mandibles, which is the jaw, the skull. So it's just they're slaughtered on site. The aging pattern with these kind of peaks here is typical for pigs slaughtered young for their meat, with some other individuals kind of kept into adulthood for breeding purposes. So unlike the other domesticates, pigs have only one product, their meat, and both of these graphs are consistent with pigs being exploited for their young, tender meat, which is unsurprising. So pigs are an animal commonly associated with feasting, with wealth, and with conspicuous consumption across royal estate centres in northwestern Europe in this period, and they overtake beef as the archetypal high status food in England in the 10th century. At Lyminge, which is a central place site in Kent in the 6th, 7th century assemblage, it's pigs that dominate, and this has been interpreted by the annalists there as being indicative of sort of continental style feasting habits. But the high numbers of both pig and beef at Rendlesham and the signatures that suggest they're being consumed probably relate to high status dining at the site. So moving on to sheep, I won't spend too long on these as sheep were the least frequent domesticate in the assemblage. But again, it seems that there's a slight peak in young animals. So lambs were being slaughtered to enjoy their meat young, with some older specimens being kept probably for wool or some dairying. The body part representation includes all of the skeleton again, but interestingly, it's largely made up of most of the meat-bearing bones, which again could suggest that this area excavated was largely consumption rather than preparation refuse. So the next dimension that I'm going to look at is the measurements of the bones, which can tell us a number of things like the sex of the animal, health, morphotype, which is the breed of the animal, and look at pathologies as well, which is any injuries or disease that we're seeing in the bone. And this is particularly important for understanding human-animal relationships, because in injury and disease, we're seeing how these animals were kept, how they're treated, and therefore how highly they were valued. So in terms of measurements, particularly for the cattle, there was a great metrical variety in the cattle bones, and you can see here the difference in these two metapodials, the same bone, but this one's much, much larger. So this could suggest, this example is probably sexual dimorphism, so a male and a female, but in some other examples, it could suggest a variety of breeds are present, and maybe cattle brought from further afield for things like the payments of renders or for exchange. Some were very, very large animals, and actually larger than contemporaneous cattle from Flixborough, which had previously been the largest in Anglo-Saxon England. And those examples from Flixborough were argued to be continental imports, potentially imports, based on their size, which has some interesting implications for the cattle at Rendlesham. So here, this is an ossified hematoma on the bone there, which is an injury often seen on draft animals, on working animals. There were also other cattle specimens with a real thickening in the foot and lower leg bones, which is also typical of working animals pulling the plough, pulling carts. The backs of their legs are getting bashed and they end up with these injuries. So it's important to note that working oxen, bulls, were very highly prized in this period with royal and status-based associations which I'll talk about a bit more further on. So here we see some periodontal disease in the tooth root. This is a sheep tooth, and the root has some disease there. And there were a few examples of this in the 7th and 8th century. Cattle and sheep had periodontal disease, and this can happen when cattle and sheep are grazed on overworked lands. So when they're moved around and they're eating kind of thorny pastures, their gums can be cut, leading to gingivitis, tooth loss, periodontal disease. So here, the skeletal evidence can be linked to agricultural intensification, and it might reflect some of the socio-economic changes and pressures in this period, and also changes in land use in this period as well. In terms of butchery, this is something that we look at, but there were very few examples of butchery actually due to the preservation on the bone at Rendlesham, although there were some chop marks on a horse tibia, which is the horse leg bone. The consumption of horse in this period is not unheard of, but there are other reasons that a horse leg bone might have chop marks on it. It might just have been carcass dismemberment, or for skinning, or for feeding to dogs. So I probably wouldn't argue for the human consumption of horse here. Speaking of dogs, these are some dog tooth marks here on this cattle bone, suggesting that the dogs may have been fed some of this high status cattle meat. So speaking about consumption and what the animals are eating, to add a kind of further dimension to this study, I selected a sample of the Rendlesham animal bone to be analysed isotopically. So this is a method typically used to reconstruct past human diets, but a lot can actually also be inferred from looking at animal diets. So this is a technique that works on the principle that the chemical composition of what's eaten is assimilated into the bodily tissues of the consumer. So when we look at the skeleton, either human or animal skeletons, and we process it, we can find the isotopic signature, and the different isotope values will plot differently in different areas, and we can basically get a general overview of different types of diets. This can be used to compare individuals within a population, or to compare populations, and yeah, it can give a sort of general guideline of the type of diet that is consumed. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'm happy to discuss it afterwards. So here we put forward some pig, domestic fowl is chicken, some dog, and some sheep to analyse isotopically, so we can see where the diets are different and where they're similar. And put simply, if we look at the sheep here, I've got one outlier, but most of the sheep here actually have quite high nitrogen values for the region, which, like the periodontal disease, is something that can actually be linked to agricultural intensification. So overworked lands or manured soils can often have higher nitrogen values, which are then assimilated into the tissues of the animals who might be grazing on those lands. So that's quite a nice insight there into land use. The pigs here, they're distinct from the herbivores, but they're also not entirely omnivorous up here. So this suggests they're probably not on the fields, but they're also probably not being kept in sties around the houses being fed on human food waste. And they might be being seasonally panaged around the local woodlands, so in a strategy separate to the sheep and cattle, but also not being kept kind of within the settlement. So chickens here, the domestic fowl, These are really interesting, as they can almost work as a reflection of human diets, as they're usually fed on the kind of scraps of human food waste. So yeah, they can reflect human diets where we don't have human skeletons to look at. And these are actually really very high status signatures. If we were looking at people, if the people were plotting up here, this is a very elevated signature for the period, suggesting a diet with a lot of animal protein, definitely, and some possible marine input as well, which would have been high status food in this period. The dogs at Rendlesham, we put the dogs here, their skeletons were quite large. They were healthy dogs living into old age, which is a contrast to some other sites where the dogs have injuries and diseases and don't seem to have been treated particularly well. So at Rendlesham, they do seem to have been treated well. And the diet here, they're almost up here with the chickens in terms of having quite a high animal protein diet. And from that, I think we can infer that they were probably quite highly valued and looked after at the site. So they may have been used for hunting, herding, guarding purposes. So the continuity of occupation is one of the things that makes Rendlesham particularly interesting site, I think. So I'm going to briefly summarise some of the key takeaway points for each phase at the site. So there was quite a small quantity of late Iron Age bone, and there was a chicken tibiotarsus or leg bone from a sealed context in the late Iron Age Trench 5, which is quite a standout find. So chicken aren't really present in the archaeological record in Britain until the early Iron Age, and even then they're extremely scarce and often present only in arguable ritual deposits. So whatever the purpose here, whether this example was used for cockfighting or ritual purposes or consumption, its presence is unusual for the period. They're only really found at elite sites, which could kind of begin to indicate an elite presence at Rendlesham from this early period. So for the early Anglo-Saxon bone, kind of 6th century, there was a partridge specimen, which again is kind of similarly interesting, as the only between the sort of mid-5th and mid-9th centuries at sites in England, partridges are quite minimally represented and only actually found at sort of confirmed elite sites. So again, this kind of implies an early sort of high status occupation and activity at the site. So the majority of the bone at Rendlesham comes from the 7th, early 8th century dark layer, and which is believed to be kind of primarily 7th and 8th century, some butchery and consumption waste. So there was a teal, which is a kind of small duck, and these are typically caught by sparrowhawks, and sparrowhawk was also present at Rendlesham. So wild fowl, like teal, are more frequently discovered at elite sites of this period, which also have hawks, kind of raptors, raptorial birds, like at Brandon and at Flixborough. And the consumption of birds caught by falconry would have probably had its own symbolism. Raptors are a prominent feature of Style 2 zoomorphic art on a variety of objects of the late 6th and 7th centuries, and these links, this kind of links them to expressions of social position, and it's argued that they would have had this kind of important role in the ideology of the ruling elites. The dominance of cattle throughout the site's occupation I've talked about a bit, but I think what's really striking in the Middle Saxon assemblage is the metrical variety and the presence of these really large working animals, because the use of cattle for draft work is sort of frequently mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon charters and wills, usually in a royal context, that the king would have this herd of cattle, strong cattle, and these oxen would be of a kind of high social and financial worth. The horses at Rendlesham, there's only a few examples really, but they all seem to have died or been killed quite young, around age 7, which is argued to be the peak age for sacrifice. But I won't speculate too much on that because I don't think there's any other real evidence for sacrifice or for ritual deposit at the site. So there was a small amount of animal bone in the late Saxon kind of phases, and one of the most fascinating finds in this phase, and I think across the assemblage as a whole, is down here. This is a mule mandible jawbone. So the remains of donkeys and of mules are extremely rare on archaeological sites in England from any period. Donkeys are known to have been integral to transport and rural life in the provinces of the Roman Empire and were brought to England with the Romans, but are argued not to have been bred in Britain. There's no real evidence for that until after the reign of Henry VIII. So mules are occasionally mentioned in the historical sources as being mounts and traction animals, but still quite rare. So the parent of this specimen would have been a donkey, and it would have been either specifically bred from the descendants of the donkeys brought over with the Romans, or it may have been a continental import. So the Rendlesham metalworking evidence, the coinage, and some of the imported material culture does suggest continental contact, and at Flixborough, the presence of imported artefacts is sort of used to argue that some of those large cattle there may have been imported. So a similar judgment could be made at Rendlesham that this may have been an import or brought over by visitors to the site, suggesting this kind of connectivity. So to reiterate and summarise some of the key kind of facets of the assemblage, this has only been a very brief overview. There was a lot more kind of in the site and a lot more to talk about, but to kind of summarise some of the most important facets, it seems that hunting was taking place to kind of actively supplement the diet, and the evidence of the partridge, I think, in the early Anglo-Saxon phase, this kind of evidence for wildfowling is particularly interesting. The sheer kind of quantity and the metrical variety in the cattle suggests maybe the payment of food, rents and renders from further afield, a level of exchange taking place at the site, and possibly even that these animals are being imported. The high quantities of juvenile cattle and pigs as well, and some of the lamb as well, are probably the result of some elite dining habits. And the presence of the mule specimen has kind of wider economic implications, and the kind of suggestion of agricultural intensification, I think, is particularly interesting in the region at the site, and that's kind of substantiated by several lines of evidence of the periodontal disease and the isotope analysis. So cattle remain significant kind of throughout the site's occupation, while sheep seem to be of much less economic importance, at least based on the subsample that's been excavated so far. And the patterns of husbandry seem to stay relatively consistent through the phases, which I think is maybe, as I've said, a reflection that Rendlesham's role and importance may have remained similarly consistent over time. So overall, this assemblage doesn't have an excessively high status signature, depending on how you would define high status. But there are some indicators there for elite activities, elite consumption, site prosperity, and a level of exchange. And I think that this is a really important assemblage and is very well placed to help kind of understand the zooarchaeological signatures of other sites, and for understanding things of like how we define status and understand how animals were used and treated in this period. Thank you.